Hi, this is the third video in this series of videos about mental imagery. The first one, I talked about what I take to be mental imagery, and I defined it as perceptual processing in the absence of corresponding sensory stimulation in the relevant sense modality. In the second one, I argued that mental imagery, if you think of it this way, is a really important feature of the vast majority of your perceptual processes. And in this one, I want to talk about multimodal mental imagery, which gives us even stronger reason to think that that's going to be a very important part of everyday perception. Mental imagery is going to be a very important part of everyday perception. It also has cool implications for various empirical and philosophical issues. So that's the plan. Multimodal perception. So here is a weird thing about perceiving. Most of the time, most of the things you see are what I call multisensory individuals. So multisensory individuals are events or entities that you encounter by means of more than one sense modalities. So you've been listening to me and you've been looking at me in the last 1 minute. So I am a multisensory individual in that sense. You got sensory information from me by means of audition and by means of vision. Now, that doesn't have to be like that. I can go like this, in which case you're only going to get auditory information and no visual information from me. So in that case, you are perceiving a multisensory individual, but you're only getting sensory stimulation from the auditory sense modality. The question is, how do you represent the visual features of multisensory individuals that you're only getting auditory sensory stimulation from? So this is a really important question, because most of what we see are multisensory individuals. In fact, there are very few individuals that we see that are not multisensory individuals, that are individuals that you can't encounter by means of more than one sense modality. So here's one example, and it's the only one I could really think of, and that's rainbows. So rainbows you can only encounter visually, not by means of other sense modalities. So good. But all the other things, you could encounter them by means of different sense modalities. But normally you don't. Normally you don't get information from all the possible sense modalities from a multisensory individual. But then how are you going to represent those features that you're not getting sensory stimulation from? And my pretty obvious example is that you do it by means of mental imagery. I want to call this multimodal mental imagery, the mental imagery that is involved here. Remember the definition of mental imagery? It's a perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the given sense modality. You've been wondering, I bet, what that last bit is doing. So that's exactly the work that it's doing. So when you do this, then you get perceptual processing in the visual sense modality, and we have a pretty good empirical reasons that happens very early on, again, in the primary visual cortex already. So you get early perceptual processing that is clearly not in the visual sense modality, that is clearly not triggered by sensory stimulation in the visual sense modality, because your visual sense modality is giving you sensory stimulation of my hand, not of my mouth. But it's triggered by sensory stimulation in your auditory sense modality. So you get perceptual processing in one sense modality that is not triggered by sensory stimulation in that sense modality. It's triggered by sensory stimulation in another sense modality, and that's multimodal mental imagery. And that could be thought of as an extension or a generalization of amodal completion, especially if you think of these multisensory individuals as this mereological complex of visible and audible things. In that case, you are going to represent some part of that complex mereological entity by means of mental imagery on the basis of acquaintance with other parts of that complex mereological entity. Good. Now I want to talk about some applications of this idea of multimodal mental imagery. The first one is going to be about sensory substitution. So that's something that really makes philosophers very excited. So sometime in the 70s, they invented these equipments that helped blind people very much. So they installed a camera on the top of their head, and the pixels that come from the camera, they were transformed into little pricks on the skin of the blind person. So you get the online transformation of the pixels that would correspond to the scene in front of the blind person into little pricks on their skin. And the interesting result is that these people started to report visual phenomenology. So they talked about one thing occluding another thing, one thing being behind another thing, one thing being further away than another thing. Whether that's really visual or not, it's a different question. And they also became pretty good at navigating very complex terrain, so they could really go around furnitures and not bump into things, which is really great for them. But philosophers also got really excited about this. And part of the reason for that is that they thought that this is going to be a really crucial data point in the big debate about how to individuate the senses. So individuation of the senses is one of these really old and venerable topics in philosophy of perception. So we have different sense modalities: vision, audition, touch. What's the difference between them? How do we draw the line between them? Do we do that by means of phenomenology, so that seeing feels different from hearing? Or do we do it by means of sense organs, maybe? Seeing is something we do with our eyes, and hearing is something we do with our ears. Very simplistic here. So philosophers really like this, perception by sensory substitution, because it seems like these criteria really come apart. If you go by phenomenology, then it seems like that's something like vision is happening here. If you go by the sense organ, then it seems like what's happening here is touch, because what's involved here is the skin. Really, it's the skin of these people that gets the sensory stimulation. Now, what do I say about this? How can the conceptual apparatus of multimodal mental imagery help here? I think it can help here a lot, because really what's going on here is that it's neither touch nor vision, because it's not perception at all. What's going on here is multimodal mental imagery. So this is going to be perceptual processing, and here I should say that there's some fairly recent data that in the primary visual cortex of these blind individuals, there is retinotopic stimulation that is obviously not based on the retinal input, because there is no retinal input. But it's based on the tactile little pricks in the skin of the blind person. Just ignore this. So good. And but then if it's multimodal mental imagery, then that's a completely irrelevant question to ask whether it's going to be touch or vision. It's going to be sensory stimulation in the tactile sense modality, triggering perceptual processing in the visual sense modality. And that's exactly the definition of multimodal mental imagery. And of course, these people are going to report that they see things, but they don't really see things. They just have multimodal mental imagery. Now, this was the first application that I wanted to give of multimodal mental imagery, and I want to give you another application. I hope that I can screen off the sound of the announcer. And that's about synesthesia. So synesthesia is the phenomenon that some subjects who when they see a certain color, let's say they see green, they're going to hear a certain very specific tone, let's say a high C. Or the other way around, they hear high C and they have they see the color green. Or they claim that they see the color green. So what's going on here? My very predictable answer again is that, and you get this kind of synesthesia kind of across all sense modalities. You get tactile and olfactory and gustatory synesthesia. What's happening here? I think what's happening here is, again, multimodal mental imagery. So what's happening when you hear the high C and you see green is that you have perceptual processing, and again, there's some data that it's very early perceptual processing, in the visual sense modality that is not triggered by the corresponding sensory stimulation in the visual sense modality. You're not looking at anything green. Maybe your eyes are closed. Nonetheless, you see green. But it is triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the auditory sense modality. It's triggered by the high C. Now you may wonder, all right, if that's multimodal mental imagery, and this is multimodal mental imagery, then what's the relation between the two? And the relation is that the correspondence relation is a little messed up in the case of synesthesia. So in this case, you can say that there's a correspondence between the visual perceptual processing of me talking and the auditory sensory stimulation. Why? Because you've been looking at lots of people talking and listening to them at the same time, and that really kind of drove home the correspondence between the auditory and the visual input in those cases when you see people talk. In the synesthesia cases, there is no kind of regular, reliable correspondence between high C and the color green. Most of the time when you hear a high C, there is nothing green around, and the other way around. So that's the only difference between those cases. So next time I'm going to talk about the epistemic implications of all that, but thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your comments.